Good morning, Brent Eviston.
Good morning, Stephen.
It's good to be here with you this morning.
Lovely to be here with you as well.
For anyone who doesn't know, for some reason you didn't see the thumbnail here on YouTube or on Proko later as part of Brent's course, we're here to do some critiquing today. We're going to be talking about some student submissions. There'll be a portion of the beginning of this that will be something that's totally free here on YouTube. And the second portion of this is going to be something that's only for people who have the course. But don't worry, we made sure to get that free part in there for you guys. I think, Brent, how many do you think we're going to go through today?
Well, I have work from 4 or 5 different students, and I have a number of drawings from each of them. So I try to select a pretty wide range of different kinds of drawings. And because the course is newer on Proko.com, this is my figure drawing course, the vast majority of the submissions were related to gesture drawing, the very first course. So in this live stream, I'm going to focus mostly on gesture drawing and get into a little bit of shading.
Okay. And what was that course, that brand new course that you mentioned that's on Proko now?
Oh, the art and science of figure drawing. So the entire suite of courses is available on Proko.com.
It's a good one. I think that the response to it, I think, has been really good. People have been excited about getting to see something that's similar to what we've offered in some ways, but very much so its own thing.
Yeah, well, one thing that's so important to realize, particularly with gesture drawing, is there are so many different ways to do it. And I remember being a beginning student and being a bit bewildered because it seemed like every artist that I talked to had a slightly different way of doing it. So it was really difficult to get a foothold. So what I try and do in these courses, and what I'm going to try and do in this critique, is to kind of strip down the gesture drawing process and to keep it really practical. And I know that when I was learning, and I'm curious to hear your experience with this, so many instructors use language like, gesture is capturing the spirit of the pose, or it's about flow and energy. And I agree with all of those things. And yet, as a beginner, they're a bit esoteric. And so I know we're all looking for practical things that we can apply to our drawings immediately. And I find that once the practical things are kind of handled, some of those more emotional or esoteric ideas start to build naturally. So that's what I've tried to do.
Yeah, I agree. So, yeah, if you had never had specific foods before and someone started talking about umami, like you got no concept of this.
Right. Let's start with sugar.
Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up some art here. For those of you guys in the chat, please do feel free to stack up some questions that we can go through after we do a critique here and Brent explains some of the portions of the things that he's teaching in the course. But I don't know necessarily how many questions we'll get to, so make them really good.
Yeah.
Please, thank you.
Yeah. All right. So before I start the official critique, I just want to lay out a few ideas that are going to be themes throughout this critique. So, the 2 most common questions I get from beginners is, what is gesture drawing? And then, why is it important? And I think, for so many people, they think of gesture drawing as merely a warm-up exercise, something to get through before they start their actual figure drawing. And gesture drawing, I look at as an essential first step. So I have a very practical definition for gesture drawing. So this is how I think about it. Gesture drawing is a simplified form of figure drawing that captures the action of the pose. And so I think there are 2 words there that I think are really important: simple and action. So when I first start a figure drawing, when you start any drawing, but particularly with figure drawing, the human figure is so complex. So we're looking for ways to simplify the figure down to its most basic components and deal with that first. And because the alternative that I see a lot of beginners try is starting off with details or small bits of anatomy. And the reality is, when you're first starting off a drawing, it's kind of like a lump of clay. You're shaping it. And we don't expect that our initial lines are necessarily going to be correct. We want something to move around. So I wanted to share just a few gesture drawings that I've done here. And so this gesture drawing you're seeing here, this is a good example of something that captures the action of the pose. And I want you to see, the curves are slightly exaggerated, but a drawing like this is all about motion. You can see it's simple. There aren't a lot of anatomical details. I'm not drawing ribs. I'm not drawing, these specific, bones of the elbow or anything like that. I'm really trying to simplify the forms of the body. And gesture drawings often look unfinished, and that's completely fine. So let me give you a few additional examples. Now, these gesture drawings here, I would say, are more finished than what I often expect in the course. But again, you can see that they have a simplicity to them. They aren't filled with a huge amount of detail, and they often have an unfinished look, which is totally appropriate. So the way I teach gesture drawing is I think it's important for a gesture drawing to be able to serve as an armature that you can later construct the rest of the figure drawing upon. And so a lot of my gesture drawings have that look. They look like they could pose them. And here's why this is so important. And this is going to be a theme we're going to keep coming back to. The initial lines are almost certainly not going to be correct. And if I pull your attention right here, this was my first attempt at the line for the leg. Then you can see another one. Then you can see a third one. Same thing down here. You can see multiple attempts at the placement of the knee. So this is what a gesture drawing serves to do. It's something we can move and change. And this is why we keep it so simple, because if you've spent 30 minutes rendering, the joint of the knee, you're very unlikely to want to move that and change it. But it's so common for beginners to, draw the figure and start shading and start adding anatomical detail, only to realize too late that an arm is too long or a leg is in the wrong place. And at that point, you're in a very difficult position. You have to either abandon the drawing or erase sometimes hours of work. And so this form of gesture drawing aims to alleviate a lot of those tough situations down the road by keeping it simple first and creating an armature that we can pose, we can move around pretty easily. So, this is a very simplified form of gesture drawing here. And so this is what I tend to look for at the very beginning of a drawing. Something that captures the action of the pose, but something that simplifies most of the parts of the body into single lines. And again, these single lines are so easy to move. So you can see, starting up here at the head, we can see this action line that travels all the way down from head to foot. It captures the entire action of the pose in a single sweep. And then the additional arms and legs are simplified into single lines. And again, these are designed to capture the direction these forms are traveling and to establish their length. At this point, they're not intended to, we're not dealing with contour, we're not dealing with anatomical detail. And because this is so simple, if an arm is too long, if a leg is too short, if a head is too big, it is so much easier to work out the proportions now when it's simple, before we start building on top of this armature. So those are the basic ideas I wanted to get across. What is gesture drawing? How are we using it? Stephen, do you have any additions here before we get to some student work?
We do have some questions here. Do you want any of those? Yeah.
I'll take a question,
And
sure.
honestly, they are coming through with the good ones. So thank you.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, this is for the students. So if they already have questions, I'm happy to answer.
Okay. So there are a couple here that I think are important to get out in the beginning.
Yes.
So Ethan asked, how do you get good with your gesture?
So, of course, practice, doing a lot of them. But other than that, I do have some things that I'd like to say about practice. So one critical mindset to get into is that gesture drawing is one of these processes that you can practice a lot without the pressure of turning it into a finished drawing. And you should practice gesture drawing that way. And I think of gesture drawing almost as a place to experiment. It's almost a bit of a laboratory that you can go to and try out different approaches. And one critical thing to remember is with gesture drawings in particular is that they are not precious. I think that with gesture drawing, we want to draw freely. We want to draw a bit expressively. We want to be able to exaggerate. And if you're feeling pressure, like it has to be good or it has to serve as the foundation for a finished drawing, that can often make people nervous and yield some pretty stiff drawings. So the mindset that I get into when I am practicing gesture drawing, and I tend to do many, many at once, I tell myself that the drawing in front of me is merely practice for the next one. And when that next drawing comes in front of me, that drawing is merely practice for the next one. And that mindset allows me to not get too caught up in the outcome of each and every drawing, but to focus much more on just the process and experimenting and trying to draw with some freedom, draw efficiently, and draw expressively. So in addition to a lot of them, yeah, just remember it's they're not going to be perfect, and feel free to explore and experiment. And yeah, and of course, drawing from life is really important. I try and go pretty regularly to local figure drawing groups, and at this stage, I also work from photographs too. But drawing gestures from life, when you know that the model can only hold the pose for 1 minute, maybe 5 minutes, it puts you in a very different mindset than when you're drawing from a photograph where you have infinite time.
I very much agree. I think like a photograph is something that you can sit and redo and redo and redo, but it's
Hmm.
really hard to get to do that with a pose. Uh,
Yeah,
we do. There are a couple of questions here, more comments maybe. So
sure.
one person said, "My gestures always look like stick figures," and another person said, "How can I exaggerate any pose without losing its believability?" Two sides of the
Mm.
spectrum here.
Okay, so regarding the stick figure, I, in a sense, like these really simplified forms of gesture drawings, like they are kind of stick figures. Although we tend to think of sticks as straighter, and the gesture drawings tend to be created from curved lines. But it's okay. Remember the initial gesture drawing process. So one thing I often tell students is the first few lines are action lines. We're not drawing the figure itself. We're drawing what the figure is doing. Now, I know that can sound a little esoteric, but one thing I often tell people is like, if you can imagine placing arrows at the ends of the lines that you're drawing. And Stephen, if you want to share my screen really quickly.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Bring this in.
yes. So this helps you remember that, we're not drawing an arm at this point. We are drawing the direction the arm is traveling. We're not depicting a leg here. We're depicting the direction the leg is traveling. And what these yield is often very much like a stick figure. And I don't mean that in any sort of pejorative way, but it can have that kind of appearance. So I did just want to get this out there at the beginning to help you understand, what it is we're trying to depict here. It's not necessarily going to be, finished drawing. So it's okay if it looks like a stick figure, as long as that stick figure is built mostly from curved lines, mostly in proportion. And so the other student asked, or the viewer, I suppose I should say, they aren't officially my students here necessarily, but I think of them all as my students. But so they asked about exaggeration. So I'm going to make a slightly controversial claim here. But one thing I often tell myself is accuracy is overrated. I
Mm,
would much prefer to see a drawing that maybe the proportions are a little off. Maybe, the anatomy seems a little extreme, but it's more beautiful and interesting. So, yeah, so I would say that there's a window of exaggeration. And I would say that window kind of maxes out at about maybe 10% exaggeration.
okay.
So one thing that the models often tell me after we do some drawings is they'll often ask, am I really that muscular? And I try and be polite about it, but the reality is no.
No, yeah, it's
No, you're
never.
not.
Yeah, you don't look as old as you look in this thing. There are details that you choose to play up in it.
Yeah, always, always. And so, and going back to this drawing, I think, this is a really good example. I would say, if you look at, the curvature of this arm, It's just, the actual curve, it was a little straighter. I exaggerated it maybe 5%. Same thing here. You can see this bulge of the thigh muscle here. It wasn't quite that curved. And so, had I drawn it now, I like this drawing quite a bit, and it looks very fluid, it's very rounded, but it's not accurate.
Mm,
I would still say it's believable, though. Well, I don't know. Would you agree? Would you say?
yeah.
And it's pushing some boundaries, but I think it's mostly believable.
Yeah, the curve is strong in both parts of the arm, but this
Hmm.
is well within the tolerance of what you can see in people.
Yeah, yeah, and looking at the forearm in particular, I think this is kind of pushing the limits
Mhm.
of what the bones of the forearm how they could curve. But again, I think it's still believable. But I prefer this to complete accuracy, which can appear a little stiff.
Yeah, and
So
you guys will have seen this, across the channel in general. There are some people who play it a little more safe. I think that you strike a solid middle balance here, where it's not super rigid. You're not doing like a Bridgman drawing where it's all just like super
right,
rigid. But you're also not doing anything like Mike Matezi, where it's very flowy and swoopy.
right. Yeah, and generally speaking, though, I prefer some exaggeration. So
Mhm.
yeah, accuracy is overrated. Feel free to exaggerate, and again, particularly in gesture drawing, if you go overboard, that's okay. And I think for most people, we going overboard, exaggerating too much, having a drawing that's too dynamic is almost always preferable to a drawing that looks stiff and, dare I say, cadaverous. When
Yeah.
your drawings are too rigid, it kind of brings a very strange quality to figure drawing. So,
Mhm. There's only one more question that I want to
yes,
get in.
yes,
Two people ask different variations on this same thing.
okay.
So we got, what are you going to use this for basically? What is the work of gesture in animation? And does this gesture drawing course help with comic artists? What are people going to put this course to, Brent?
Yeah. So one of the things I love about gesture drawing is it's applicable across the board for any kind of figurative work that you're going to do. And it is the doorway into figure drawing, of any form of figure drawing. And so particularly, for things like animation, we talk about the movement of a pose. Now, animation, you're dealing with actual movement, but part of how that's achieved is if you freeze frame any part of an animated film, the characters look as if they are frozen in mid motion. They
Mhm.
don't appear static. And so one quality I often like my gesture drawings to have, and let me kind of pull in a couple of others here.
Mhm.
I like my gesture drawings to almost have a quality, as the way I talk about it to myself is I want them to look like a coiled spring, like they could
Mm.
burst into motion, burst into action at any moment. That there's almost like a vibration occurring there, that they can just barely hold the pose. Like I want to bring that sense. And there are a number of different ways to accomplish that, but
Well, yeah,
it's so much about motion. It's so much about capturing and freezing motion.
I
And
was wondering,
so,
what would you
yeah.
say to a student? Are the like in the previous drawing that you had there? What
Mhm.
would the things be that you think are driving that feeling of that coiled spring that's ready to go?
Yeah, so there are a few things. I think that there's, you can see these initial gesture lines. So I'm sure this has been kind of covered in other places in a course, but we have a lot of what's called pentimenti, right? So these are early attempts at the gesture drawing. So once again, you can see here that I have all these initial attempts. I try and be a little wild in my first attempt, so usually things are out of proportion. I kind of slowly bring them back into proportion, but so many people when they're doing a drawing tend to erase all that stuff, and
Mhm.
I love seeing it. I part of what's so beautiful about a drawing is you get to see the thought process of the artist who's creating them. And I think it's almost like seeing a handwritten manuscript for a book you love, something like that. Like you get to see the notes, you get to see the thinking, and I think that's so much more compelling than drawings that are really pristine, that have everything erased. So yeah, I like that thought process. And so you can, another thing is that drawing is a transparent medium. So you can see it's closer to watercolor than it is to oil paint. You can
Mm,
see all of the lines through it. So I think leaving all those process lines creates a really beautiful sense of motion. And so here, I also think the lines being drawn somewhat quickly. And
mhm.
I never want to, gesture drawing isn't about speed. It's not about drawing fast, but we can, a line that is drawn more quickly just looks and feels different on the page than a line that was drawn really slowly.
Yeah.
And so with the gesture drawing in particular, I do like the lines to feel like they're a little they're drawn somewhat quickly. Now
Yeah.
these are kind of pushing gesture, these are starting to have a lot more shading to them. And I'm going to talk about this at the end of this critique because that is a common question I get. It's
Mhm.
like, why are you putting shading in gesture drawings? And the short answer is design, but we'll get into that later on.
The one
S-
thing I would say for people who are wondering, like is when you go to draw something and you want to have it feel like it has that motion to it and you do a quick stroke, it doesn't have to be that you're blazing through a drawing and you're
right.
knocking it out in like mere seconds. The lines will feel quicker in relation to each other.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be that this one is the fastest line anyone's ever drawn, just faster than the others that you've placed.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. And there's a whole range of lines, line speeds in a drawing like this. And I talk about, I want it to look like the figure could kind of burst into motion at any moment. But I also like the drawings to feel I want you to see the mind moving as well. I want you to see the mind working through a
Mhm.
problem. And I think that's what makes gesture so beautiful and interesting. I often like these unfinished gesture drawings more than I like drawings that I've spent 3, 4, 7 hours,
Mhm.
rendering. And I know they just have a quality to them that I find to be very exciting. So
I agree. I think that's the last question I'll give you. Do you want to give these people here in this room a critique, an example of a
yes.
critique?
Yes. So the first thing I want to say is I want to thank those of you who submitted work. Now, having your work critiqued at all is terrifying. Having it critiqued live on YouTube, I mean, it's a terrifying experience. So for those of you who submitted it, thank you so much for doing that. We cannot do these critiques without you brave souls who are submitting your work to be looked at. So thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, so first we have some drawings by Marco. Now, I want to keep these ideas in mind. I want to keep in mind the idea that a gesture drawing is a simplified form of drawing that captures the action of the pose. And initially, we want to create something of an armature that we can build upon. Now, one of the first things I want to point out is with this drawing here. So I'm really loving this swoop that we have going down, the entire figure. Now, I could see this being, exaggerated even more as you're drawing. And one of the reasons I think exaggeration is so important is because when we draw the human figure, we have a natural tendency to stiffen the pose. Now, I have this hypothesis that we have this subconscious desire to help stabilize the model in dynamic poses that we have a concern, we have empathy for the models. Are they going to fall over? Is that pose really hard to hold? So we often end up stiffening a very dynamic pose. And the model that I have in the figure drawing course, like she's incredible. She really knows how to move her body and like tilt the different parts of her body, get into these really dynamic poses. And that's one thing I see all the time at the beginning is these poses being much more stiff. The axis lines are closer to horizontal. The legs aren't thrown as back. And so I find, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. I find that when I attempt to exaggerate, when I feel like I've gone too far, I'm actually more likely to capture what's actually in the pose.
Yeah.
So this is a very counterintuitive way to approach it. You intend to exaggerate beyond what you see in order to get closer to what's actually there.
Yeah.
So again, I know it sounds counterintuitive, but that's a big part of it.
I think this is a thing that the person we mentioned earlier, Mike Matezi, would also agree with, and he's here in the chat right now.
Oh, he is.
Yeah, he
Okay.
jumped in. He jumped in and said, "Nice force in that drawing, Brent." And he capitalized force in the Mike Matezi way.
Yeah. Well, it's a critical part of it.
Yeah, I think
So
swing for the fences, over exaggerate, and then you can find at the very least if you need to pull back. But chances
yes.
are you'll going too far will be where you actually want to land.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to take a note here, and I'm going to get pretty specific into some very into individual lines here because I think they create a lot to talk about. So right here we have this leg that's coming out this way. Now, knowing the original pose, I appreciate the attempt to want to have this line kind of flow right out there, but it is okay in a gesture drawing to have lines collide if that's what they're doing in the original pose. So, I think this leg, would have worked a little better coming out in a more convex way before kind of changing direction, and heading toward the foot. And so, uh, again, the Marco is full, it has created this line that's flowed right out of there. And again, I think it's okay to let the lines collide because that's what's happening in the actual pose.
Mhm.
So this leg is bearing the weight and it is jutting out from this initial gesture line, and it's got a lot of weight there. So I think that's okay to capture. Now this gets into an interesting area where I would say that gesture drawing is a bit subjective. And so Marco has a couple of interesting solutions here that I wanted to call attention to. So I'd like to move over to the drawing on the left. And we'll see this a few times in some of Marco's drawings. So this V shape here in the pelvis is an interesting solution. Now, I will admit that initially I was going to discourage Marco from using that because it's very different from what I teach in the course. But here's the thing, Marco, it seems risky to me, but a lot of my gesture process is based on things that I was told not to do or wouldn't work. And so, you know what? If this is something that works for you, if you're experimenting with this, and let me pull up a couple of others to see if it, yeah, here it is again.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I haven't seen this before. I could see how it could work.
Yeah,
And
because
so, yeah, so it's
it's
this
it's
kind of,
it's a little bit of that. What's that? The mnemonic shorthand. Patrick Jones uses one for the V of the pelvis, but
mhm.
it's not like a true one for one. So I don't know if that's where he's getting it from. But
Yeah. So, yeah, and shorthand is a really good word. So let me kind of, do a little pelvis construction here. So typically, what these gestures should ultimately try and create is, the initial structure for a more finished drawing. So, if we have the bowl for the pelvis here, we have the anterior superior iliac spines, which in this pose would probably be, maybe here and here. And we have the inguinal ligaments kind of coming down and connecting at the symphysis of the pubis. And so it looks like this line, though, is more kind of where the leg connects. So, you know, uh, when you're in a course, there's always going to be the specific way the instructor teaches something.
mhm,
But then you have, I'm encouraging experimentation too. So, and this side looks like it's actually an attempt at three dimensionality where the leg is, this leg is going to connect.
agreed.
So, and that could work. I would say though, to successfully incorporate this V, and here we see it in this pose as well. You can see that over here. Um, I think you're going to need to create, a form of gesture that's incorporating those just a little further into what you're doing. So, when I'm drawing gesture, I tend to recommend people draw the convex side of forms And so, yeah, the convex is the part that bulges outward, and that tends to be more believable when we draw things. And you've done that almost everywhere else. This line is convex, this line is convex, but here you kind of scooped inward, and this is much more concave. So I would say if you're going to experiment with this V for the pelvis, you may want to try and incorporate some of the more convex lines, into these forms, just to see, just to make sure that you're capturing the proportions as well.
Mhm.
So this line I wanted to talk about too. So this line here is traveling up the left side of the rib cage and up the arm. Now, and then we have what I assume is a center line here. So this gets a little tricky, but what I would recommend is when you're drawing gestures, you want to be very careful about these placements. So if this is a center line and if this is the left side of the rib cage, this is a lot of space in between those two elements. So it's okay, at some point if you need to break up these lines. One thing I talk about in the course is that you want to, in your initial gesture drawings, you want to see if you can simplify the pose down to as few lines as possible. But that doesn't mean that it's not so strict that you have to start to alter the proportions of the pose to create that sense. So yeah, I wanted to go back to this one. And I know we'll be wrapping up soon here. Are there any other additional, what do we need for our YouTube viewers right now before we get going? Any other questions or
There was one other one that I think would be good to kind of button things up with here.
Okay.
So while you were going into it and you were talking about pushing beyond as what is like almost the median, like you assume the beyond is the median. Karen Doda was asking, would you use the same approach if you were not drawing dynamic figure drawing, like if you were doing a regular figure? Not sure how to put that, she said.
Yeah. I still would use, so I look at every pose as being somewhat dynamic. Now, I want to put a caveat here that this is personal preference. I am sure that many artists would disagree with me on this, but part of what I try and do is, even in an incredibly static reclining pose where there's almost no action, there's no straining going on, I still tend to like to draw it as if there's a vibration there. And this is important because we're drawing the human figure and it must look alive, because if it doesn't look alive, then it looks dead. And that unless that's the point, unless that's what you're rendering, then I think looking for ways to give that sense of life is important. And yeah, so I would draw dynamically and gesturally, even in a much more static pose, unless the point, there's been a lot of classical artwork that depicts lifeless bodies, and they have a very different look to them. And so that I think for the most part is something that we want to try and counteract. We want them to look vibrant, we want them to look alive, we want them to look conscious even. So and go ahead.
That's one that I think you find as you learn more about drawing and rendering in general. There's so many things that you kind of you think, are you trying to adhere to the reference that you have in front of you, or try to make something technically correct? But there are a lot of things that you imply with the lines that you do and don't make in a piece. If you really emphasize something, you can very quickly run into a spot where you're communicating something that you're not trying to. Being intentional about that and making sure that you're making something move versus something being static and implying, like you said, death is very important as one of those.
Yeah, and Stephen, I know what we are running up against time. Can I have 3 more minutes just to get something out to the live YouTube audience?
Yeah, please do.
Really quickly. So in terms of the figure looking alive, I wanted to point this out right here. So one way you can start to think about the figure, even at these early stages, is as a combination of, it's a functional machine, but it is also a living organism. So right here, you know, we have this line that's going up to represent the spine. And if this were a living figure, this person would not, you know, be in good shape, right? So, you know, one thing we want to make sure we're doing is capturing something that's believable in terms of, you know, the living body. And so capturing simple curves like the spine. Now, this takes a while to develop, but you can almost start to develop empathy. So, you know, this person, you know, this is drawn where this is scooped out too far. You know, this line for the spine was going in the wrong direction. And this person wouldn't, if we created a real person out of this drawing, they probably wouldn't be able to walk, they wouldn't be able to stand. So you can almost start to think about the functional machine as you're drawing it. You know, if you draw a neck too thin, well, that person might not be able to breathe. If you draw a rib cage like too small, like the lungs wouldn't be able to expand. So you can almost bring this sense that you're responsible for bringing life into this drawing, into this figure. So anyway, that's just something I wanted to throw in there really quick about the importance of giving the illusion of life and the illusion of a figure that can live and can live comfortably and do what it needs to do. And it's a very different way of thinking about a drawing, but I think it's one that can be very valuable if you get into that mindset.
I agree. So yeah, like Brent was mentioning there, this is the point where we're going to be rolling over into the part of the stream that will be for the people who are part of the course. Everyone who's here, you guys have been wonderful. You guys genuinely brought better questions than a lot of what comes up in some of the streams sometimes. So I really appreciate that. Again, Brent's course can be found at this link here that you guys can see on screen. It's in the description. But I'm going to end this stream, and we will see you guys on the rest of the YouTube channel later.
Right.
To everyone else, thank you so much for paying for this course. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to end this one now.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, that is ended.
Okay.
Now,